exactly 12:41 a.m. local time, on March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 rolled down the runway at Kuala Lumpur International Airport and lifted into the night sky. The aircraft was Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Before we begin, unfolds slowly and deliberately. Details matter, silences matter. If this investigation resonates, consider supporting the channel by subscribing and enabling notifications. It allows stories like this, complex, unresolved, and often overlooked, to continue being told in full. Now, we return to the moment it began. It was a routine overnight flight bound for Beijing, scheduled to arrive just after sunrise. The route was well-traveled. The weather was calm. The aircraft was mechanically sound. Nothing about the departure suggested urgency, danger, or deviation from normal procedure. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into long-haul flight routines. Dimmed lights, seatbelts fastened, electronic devices stowed. In the cockpit, the crew followed a sequence practiced thousands of times before. 40 minutes later, as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, air traffic control requested a standard handoff. The response came back calmly, clearly, and without hesitation. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those words were not unusual. They were not rushed. They were not distressed. They were the last confirmed human words ever transmitted from the aircraft. Less than a minute later, MH370 disappeared from civilian radar. No emergency code was entered. No mayday was spoken. No warning alarm sounded. The plane did not explode. It did not descend rapidly. It did not vanish in a flash. Instead, it simply stopped being visible to the systems designed to track it. In the hours that followed, families would wake to unanswered phone calls. Airports would display delayed where arrived should have been. Governments would begin searching oceans that stretched beyond reliable maps. And over time, the disappearance of Flight MH370 would become something aviation had never confronted before. Not a crash, not a hijacking, not a confirmed accident, but a question. How does a modern passenger aircraft, carrying 239 people, disappear without a trace? By the early 2010s, commercial aviation had reached a level of reliability unmatched in its history. Fatal accidents were increasingly rare, and when they did occur, investigators could almost always determine what happened, sometimes within days, often within weeks. Aircraft were tracked continuously. Pilots were trained for layered failure scenarios. Redundancy was built into nearly every system. The idea that a large commercial jet could simply disappear no longer seemed plausible. The Boeing 777 represented this confidence. It was designed for long-haul international routes, capable of flying for more than 15 hours without refueling. By 2014, hundreds of these aircraft were in service worldwide, logging millions of flight hours. The type had a strong safety record, with no previous losses attributed solely to unexplained causes. Malaysia Airlines operated under international safety standards and maintained one of the youngest fleets in Southeast Asia. Flight MH370 was not a charter, not a special operation, and not under heightened security. It was scheduled, ticketed, and cleared like any other international flight. The passengers reflected that normalcy. Among them were families traveling for holidays, students returning to school, business travelers, and a group of engineers heading to an international technology conference in Beijing. 20 nationalities were represented. Nothing about the manifest raised immediate concern. In the cockpit were 2 pilots who met all regulatory requirements. The captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, was a senior training captain with over 18,000 flight hours. He was familiar with the route and the aircraft. Colleagues described him as experienced and methodical. The first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid, had logged more than 2,700 flight hours and was nearing qualification as a fully independent captain. This flight was a routine opportunity to build experience under supervision. There was no indication of conflict, impairment, or operational disagreement before departure. From a systems perspective, the flight plan was straightforward. After departure from Kuala Lumpur, MH370 was expected to fly northeast over the South China Sea, cross into Vietnamese airspace, and continue toward Beijing along established air corridors. Air traffic control responsibility would pass smoothly from Malaysia to Vietnam, then onward to China, a process that occurred thousands of times each day. At the time, aircraft tracking relied on a combination of secondary surveillance radar, satellite communication, and automatic reporting systems. While not continuous in the way modern consumers might expect, these systems had proven sufficient for decades. No one anticipated that the disappearance of MH370 would expose critical blind spots, not in one system, but across several, operating independently. And when those blind spots aligned, they created a window of uncertainty large enough for a wide-body jet to vanish. The context matters because MH370 did not disappear in an era of primitive technology or lax oversight. It disappeared in a world that believed it had already solved this problem. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport on schedule at 12:41 a.m. local time. The aircraft climbed normally to cruising altitude. Engine data, later recovered from satellite logs, showed no abnormalities during this phase of flight. Weather along the planned route was stable, with no major storm systems that would have required deviation. At 12:49 a.m., the aircraft reached approximately 25,000 feet. By 1:01 a.m., it leveled off near its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. At 1:07 a.m., the aircraft transmitted its final ACARS message. ACARS, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, automatically sends maintenance and performance data to the airline. This transmission contained routine information. Nothing in it suggested mechanical failure, fire, or system distress. 12 minutes later, at 1:19 a.m., Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control instructed the flight to contact Ho Chi Minh City Area Control Center as it approached the edge of Malaysian airspace. The captain acknowledged the instruction. "Good night, Malaysian 370. This was a standard phrase, delivered calmly. There was no sign of hesitation, confusion, or urgency. At approximately 1:21 a.m., two things happened almost simultaneously. First, the aircraft's secondary surveillance radar, transponder, stopped transmitting. This system allows air traffic control to see an aircraft's identity, altitude, and speed. When it stopped, MH370 appeared to vanish from civilian radar displays. Second, the aircraft deviated from its planned route. Instead of continuing northeast toward Vietnam, military primary radar, which does not rely on transponder signals, later showed an unidentified aircraft turning sharply to the west, crossing back over the Malaysian peninsula. This turn was not random. It was deliberate, smooth, and consistent with controlled flight. Over the next hour, the aircraft continued northwest, passing near the island of Penang, then out over the Andaman Sea. The altitude varied, though the exact profile remains uncertain due to radar limitations. During this entire period, no distress call was made. No emergency transponder code was activated. No attempt to contact air traffic control was recorded. At 2:25 a.m., more than an hour after radar contact was lost, a satellite operated by Inmarsat received a brief, automated signal from the aircraft. This signal did not include location data. It simply indicated that the aircraft's satellite communication system was powered on and functioning. Similar automated handshakes were recorded approximately once per hour for the next 6 hours. These signals suggested the aircraft remained airborne. They also suggested that someone or something had restored power to systems that had previously gone offline. At 8:19 a.m., the final satellite handshake was received. Based on fuel calculations, investigators believe this moment closely coincided with the aircraft's fuel exhaustion. What happened next, whether the aircraft glided, descended uncontrolled, or broke apart, is unknown. There were no further signals, no radar contact, no confirmed eyewitnesses. By the time authorities fully understood that MH370 had not crashed along its intended route, the aircraft had already been missing for hours. and the trail it left behind was fragmentary. Radar traces, automated pings, and silence. The investigation into Flight MH370 began before anyone realized just how large it would become. When the aircraft failed to contact Vietnamese air traffic control shortly after 1:21 a.m., the initial assumption was not an emergency. Missed radio handoffs occurred occasionally, often due to frequency confusion or minor technical issues. Controllers attempted to re-establish contact using multiple channels. There was no response. For several hours, uncertainty persisted. No emergency phase was declared immediately. No large-scale search was launched during the window when the aircraft might still have been airborne and detectable. By the time Malaysia Airlines publicly announced that contact had been lost, daylight had already passed over much of the intended route. Early search efforts focused on the South China Sea, along the aircraft's planned path toward Beijing. Naval vessels and aircraft from Malaysia, Vietnam, China, and neighboring countries were deployed. Satellite images were reviewed. Oil slicks were reported, then ruled out. Floating objects were sighted, then identified as unrelated debris. As days passed without confirmed wreckage, investigators revisited available radar data. It was during this reanalysis that Malaysian military radar operators confirmed that an unidentified aircraft had been tracked crossing the Malay Peninsula and heading west after the transponder stopped transmitting. This revelation fundamentally changed the investigation. The search area expanded dramatically, first toward the Andaman Sea, then outward into the Indian Ocean. At the same time, investigators turned to a source of data that had not been intended for accident reconstruction: satellite communication logs. Engineers at Inmarsat analyzed the timing and frequency shifts of the automated handshake signals exchanged between the aircraft and a geostationary satellite. By measuring these subtle variations, they were able to estimate the aircraft's distance from the satellite at each ping. This analysis produced two broad arcs, one stretching north into Central Asia, the other south into the Indian Ocean. The northern route crossed multiple countries with dense radar coverage. No nation reported unidentified aircraft matching MH370's profile. Attention increasingly focused on the southern arc. What followed was the largest and most complex search operation in aviation history. Ships and aircraft scoured vast areas of open ocean. Sonar-equipped vessels mapped the seafloor in regions deeper and more remote than any previous aviation search. The challenges were immense. The Indian Ocean is subject to powerful currents, extreme depths, and unpredictable weather. Much of the seabed had never been mapped in detail. Search equipment had to operate thousands of meters below the surface, often at the limits of existing technology. Despite these efforts, no crash site was located. No flight recorders were recovered. No main fuselage sections were found. As months turned into years, the investigation faced increasing limitations: technical, financial, and political. By 2017, after covering more than 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, the official underwater search was suspended. The disappearance of MH370 had not been solved, but the investigation was not over. What remained were fragments, both physical and informational, and a growing list of unanswered questions. For more than a year after the disappearance, there was no confirmed physical evidence from Flight MH370. Then, in July 2015, a piece of aircraft debris washed ashore on Réunion Island, a French territory in the western Indian Ocean, nearly 4,000 kilometers from the aircraft's last known position. The object was identified as a flaperon, a movable control surface from the trailing edge of a Boeing 777 wing. Serial numbers and manufacturing records later confirmed it belonged to MH370. This discovery marked the first undeniable proof that the aircraft had entered the Indian Ocean. Over the next several years, additional debris was found along the coasts of Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, and nearby islands. Some pieces were conclusively linked to MH370. Others were deemed likely but unconfirmed. The geographic spread of these fragments matched ocean drift models originating from the southern Indian Ocean. But the debris told only part of the story. None of the recovered pieces showed evidence of fire, explosion, or structural breakup at altitude. The damage patterns were consistent with high-energy impact with water, though they could not determine the aircraft's orientation or speed at the moment of impact. Crucially, no debris field was ever discovered. In most ocean crashes, floating wreckage appears within days. MH370 left no such trail. This suggested either a steep, high-speed descent or breakup that produced little buoyant material, though neither explanation could be confirmed. Alongside the physical evidence, the Inmarsat satellite data remained the most important informational artifact of the case. While the handshake signals could not provide location, they did indicate that the aircraft continued flying for nearly 7 hours after its last radio transmission. Frequency shifts in those signals suggested changes in speed and direction, particularly during the final moments of flight. Some analysts interpreted these shifts as consistent with a descent. Others cautioned that the data resolution was too low to support definitive conclusions. There were also notable absences. No emergency locator transmitter was detected. No cockpit voice recordings were recovered. No Mayday or automated distress message was received. Equally puzzling was the aircraft's systems behavior. Some communication systems shut down abruptly, while others resumed operation later. Whether this resulted from manual action, electrical interruption, or cascading failures remains unresolved. Each piece of evidence added clarity in one area, while deepening uncertainty in another. The fragments confirmed the aircraft's fate. They did not explain its path. And as the evidence accumulated, investigators faced a difficult reality. The most critical data, the kind that explains why, was still missing. As the investigation progressed without a definitive cause, attention turned to explanations that could account for what little was known. Each theory attempted to reconcile the same set of facts: a deliberate course change, the loss and partial restoration of communication systems, hours of continued flight, and a final disappearance in a remote region of the ocean. None of these explanations has been proven. Each remains constrained by missing data. One of the most discussed theories involves deliberate human intervention from within the cockpit. Supporters of this explanation point to the aircraft's controlled turn back across the Malaysian peninsula and its continued navigation along waypoints consistent with manual input. The shutdown of the transponder and ACAR system also appears on the surface to require intentional action. Investigators examined the background of the flight crew in detail. Digital simulations were recovered from the captain's home flight simulator. Malaysian authorities stated that these simulations did not constitute evidence of intent or planning. No motive was established. No personal, financial, or ideological trigger was identified, and no communication was ever made to suggest deliberate action. The theory explains the navigation. It does not explain the silence. Another explanation focuses on catastrophic systems failure, possibly involving electrical fire or avionics malfunction. Modern aircraft rely on extensive electrical networks. A failure in certain areas could disable communication systems while leaving the aircraft flyable for a period of time. Proponents suggest that smoke or decompression could have incapacitated the crew, allowing the aircraft to continue on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. This theory aligns with the absence of a distress call. However, it struggles to account for the precise timing and sequencing of system shutdowns, as well as the aircraft's apparent navigation along specific tracks. A third theory considers external interference, including hijacking or unlawful intervention. Investigators examined passenger backgrounds, cargo manifests, and security footage. No credible claims of responsibility were made. No demands followed the disappearance. No evidence emerged of a struggle or forced entry. While not impossible, the theory lacks supporting evidence. Other explanations, including hypoxia, rapid decompression, and even rare structural anomalies, have been explored in technical reports and academic analyses. Each can explain certain elements. None can explain all of them. What makes MH370 uniquely difficult is not the absence of theories, but the inability to test them conclusively. Without flight recorders, investigators cannot determine the sequence of cockpit actions, system states, or crew responses. Theories remain theoretical, and the case remains open, not legally, but practically. In the years following the suspension of the official search, MH370 did not fade from attention entirely. Instead, it entered a quieter phase, one driven by incremental data releases, independent analysis, and evolving technology rather than large-scale government operations. In 2018, a privately funded search effort was launched by the company Ocean Infinity, using autonomous underwater vehicles capable of scanning the seabed more efficiently than earlier systems. These vehicles operated at extreme depths, covering areas previously unreachable or inadequately mapped. Despite months of searching, no wreckage was found. The effort was concluded without success. Governments involved in the original investigation stated that while active searching had ended, new evidence would prompt reconsideration. No such evidence has yet emerged. Meanwhile, researchers continued to refine models of the aircraft's final trajectory. Advances in ocean drift modeling allowed analysts to re-examine how debris might have traveled from a potential crash site to the locations where fragments were recovered years later. Some models suggested narrower search areas than previously explored. Others produced overlapping but inconsistent results. Satellite data was also reanalyzed as methodologies improved. Independent teams attempted to extract additional information from the Inmarsat handshake signals. Though the fundamental limitation remained, the data was never designed to track aircraft. Public access to investigative reports and raw data led to increased involvement from independent analysts, engineers, pilots, mathematicians, working outside official frameworks. While these efforts produced new perspectives, none yielded definitive conclusions. Perhaps the most tangible legacy of MH370 lies not in new discoveries, but in systemic change. In the years after the disappearance, international aviation authorities implemented new requirements for aircraft tracking, particularly over remote oceanic regions. Airlines adopted improved position reporting and, in some cases, real-time data streaming during abnormal events. These changes were intended to ensure that no future aircraft could vanish without leaving a clearer digital trail. And yet, for MH370 itself, those improvements came too late. The aircraft remains unfound. The search remains incomplete. What has changed is our understanding of how much uncertainty can still exist, even in a system built on precision. At 12:41 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur as an ordinary commercial flight. It followed established procedures, operated within regulated airspace, and was monitored by systems that had been trusted for decades. Within an hour, it was no longer where it was supposed to be. Within hours, it was no longer visible. And within days, it became clear that this was not a conventional aviation accident. What is known about MH370 is specific, limited, and carefully documented. The aircraft remained airborne for several hours after communication was lost. It deviated from its planned route in a controlled manner. Fragments of the aircraft later washed ashore along the western Indian Ocean. What is not known is more substantial. We do not know why the aircraft changed course. We do not know who, if anyone, was in control during its final hours. We do not know the precise location of the crash, the final descent profile, or the condition of the aircraft in its last moments. Every major theory explains some of these unknowns and fails to explain others. Without the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, investigators are left interpreting indirect evidence, radar traces, satellite signals, and debris patterns, none of which were designed to answer the questions now being asked of them. MH370 occupies a rare place in modern history. It is not the oldest unsolved aviation mystery. It is not the deadliest, but it is perhaps the most unsettling, because it occurred in an era that believed such disappearances were no longer possible. The systems have since changed. Tracking has improved. Safeguards have been added. But for the 239 people on board Flight MH370, those changes arrived after the fact. Until the aircraft is found, if it ever is, the story of MH370 remains incomplete. Not because there are no answers, but because the answers are still somewhere beyond reach, resting on the ocean floor, waiting to be discovered. And until that day comes, one question remains, quietly, persistently, and without resolution. Why did Malaysian Flight MH370 disappear?